Okay, so we're on Daf Kuf Gimel Amud Daf Kuf Gimel, and we're starting on Kuf Bet Amud Bet right at the bottom. We saw yesterday that we were discussing the order in which we should do the brachot for Havdalah, and we saw that if it's Motzei Shabbat and it's also Yom Tov, that Rav said Yakna, Yain Kiddush Ner Havdalah. That first you say Brei Pri Hagafen, then you say Baruch Makadesh Yisrael B'Hazmanim, then you say Borei Meoreh Ha'esh, and then you say Havdalah. And that's actually the order that we do today on the seventh night of Pesach, particularly when you don't say She'echiyanu. Today we'll see that there's a whole bunch of opinions about what you should say, and that's what we're going to have a look at now. So, the Gemara that begins, Gufa, Yom Tov Shechal Lehiyot Achar Shabbat. So on a Yom Tov which falls after Shabbat, it goes on to say there are various differences of opinion. Rav Amar Yakneh, Shmuel Amar Yinhak, Rabba Amar Yanek. We're at the top of page top of page Kuf Gimel now. Rabba Amar Yanek, Levi Amar Kni'ah, Rabbanan Amar Kin'ah, Mar Barei Deravna Amar Nekiah. And then Marta Amar Mishmei Rabbi Yoshua, Marta says in the name of Rabbi Yoshua, who is a Tana, he says Nihak. So what are these things? These are all acronyms. So Rav says Yanak, that's Yain Kiddush Ner Havdalah, and Shmuel says Yain Ner Havdalah Kiddush. So he's switched the order of Havdalah and Kiddush here, and he's also put them next to each other, as though you'd say one's going out, one's coming in. Rabba is saying Yain Havdalah Ner V'Kiddush, very similar to Shmuel, but Rabba seems to think that in fact there's a ner between Havdalah and Kiddush. The Rashbam suggests that because he thinks that Havdalah is going to be weakened by the Kiddush. If they put them right next to each other, they kind of cancel each other out. So you need something in between. Levi says Kiddush ner Yain Havdalah, and Rabbanan say Kiddush Yain ner Havdalah. Both of them think that Kiddush and Havdalah need to be separated as much as possible. They just switch the order of the ner and the Yain. But both of them think Kiddush comes before the Yain. That's a different issue. Mar Barei Ravna says Ner Kiddush Yain Havdalah, and then Rabbi Yoshua says Ner Yain Havdalah Kiddush. So these are all differences of opinion. Now the Rishonim do discuss what the reasons for these differences are. That's not the important thing for us to deal with today. There is another opinion which is brought slightly differently in the Gemara, because the Gemara then goes on to say that Shalach le Avua da Shmuel Rabbi. So Shmuel's father, Shmuel was the first generation Amora, and his father lived at the time of Rabbi Yehuda Anasi, who wrote the Mishnah. And he actually wrote to Rabbi Yehuda Anasi to ask him, what am I supposed to do? What order do I do on Motzei Shabbat, that's Yom Tov? What should I do? And he says, Yilamdeinu Rabbeinu, teach us, O Master, Seder Havdalot Heach. How do you do the Seder of the order of the Havdalah? V'shalach le Rabbi Yehuda Anasi sent him a note and replied to him, Kach amar Rabbi Yishmael bar Rabbi Yossi, she'amar mishum Aviv, she'amar mishum Rabbi Yoshua ben Chananya. He gives a whole chain of learning right back to one of the earliest Tanaim, Rabbi Yoshua ben Chananya, and he says, Nahik. What you do is Ner Havdalah Yain Kiddush. So you've got a number of different permutations here that you can have. There's actually a maximum of 24 permutations here. They haven't done all of them, but they've done a heck of a lot. We've got various different opinions, and it doesn't leave us much wiser as to what we're supposed to be doing. But what I'm going to look at right now is what the Gemara looks at, which is to say, let's just focus in on one particular issue, and that is whether the Havdalah comes before the Kiddush or Kiddush b'Havdalah. And what they bring here is Amar Rabbi Chanina. Rabbi Chanina has a mashal. Rabbi Chanina heard a story which he'd heard from Rabbi Yoshua ben Chananya. And he said that this is as follows. The reason why you do Havdalah before Kiddush is a bit like a king. Mashal lemelech hayotze va'apelkos nichnas. So a king who is looking after a city, he's in charge of a city, he goes and leaves the city. I don't know, he's going to war, he's going to a different city, I don't know. But what's important is he leaves behind a governor to look after the city. So what do you do in such a situation? Melavin et hamelech. So first you accompany the king out of the city, and then what you're doing is you then bring in the governor who's coming into the city after the king has left. It's a bit like Shabbos. Shabbos is leaving, that's the Havdalah, and then you bring in Yom Tov afterwards. That's why you do Havdalah before you do Kiddush. That's a nice way of looking at it, and explains kind of why that might be. Nevertheless, we haven't got halacha here. We're kind of a bit confused as to what we're actually supposed to do. We've got lots of differences of opinions. So when it gets to the later Amoraim, Abaya and Rava, who are in the 4th generation of the Amoraim, ask the simple question, Mai have Allah? What's the halacha? What are we supposed to actually do? And so Abaya says, Yakzahnaha, which is Yain Kiddush Zman Ner Havdalah. So he says the wine first, then Kiddush, then you say Shechianu, then you say light the candle, and then you do Havdalah. Note that they're not adding in this case Shechianu, which you would say on the first day of Yom Tov. And Rava, he says you say Yaknahaz. Yaknahaz is Yain, Kiddush, Ner, Havdalah, and Zman. So his order is this way. Okay. If you actually look in the Machzor today, you will see Shehilchataka Rava, that we actually do the halacha like Rava. We have the wine first, we say Brei Pri Hagafen, then we say Mekadesh Yisrael V'Hazmanim, then we say Borei Mu'ai Ha'esh, then we say Hamavdil Ben Kodesh L'Chol, and then we say Shechianu. That's the order. If you actually look in a Machzor for the first night of Chag, that's exactly what we are supposed to do today. Now, it is interesting, if you look at Rava's opinion, and that's the halacha, and you look at all the ones on the top, it's actually exactly the same as Rav's. Yes, he's added Shechianu, but apart from that, it's exactly the same as Rav's. Yain, Kiddush, Ner, V'Havdalah. What is particularly interesting here is that Rav, I've put it in blue here at the side, is an Amora. And you'd have thought that the argument that we'd take the earlier sources, which are Tanaim. So it is a bit strange that the halacha goes by Rav, until you remember that in fact Rav was also a Tana. Rav was also right on the edge between the time of the Mishnah and the time of the Gemara. He was right on the edge, and in some ways, and including now, he is considered like a Tana, and therefore his opinion has weight, the weight of a Tana. So therefore, it shouldn't be that surprising that we're paskening. The halacha goes a bit like him. Moving on now, we come to a whole set of parties, dinner parties. We have various Rabbanim visiting other Rabbanim. It's going to go on for a while, this. Today and tomorrow, there's a bunch of stories about people visiting. So what we're going to look at here is the first of these stories is Rav Huna Bar Yehuda. Rav Huna Bar Yehuda goes to visit Rava, and you'll see Rav Huna Bar Yehuda ikla leve. Rava, that's the standard description of a rabbi going to visit another rabbi. Ikla means to visit. Va'aitu lekamayu, and they bring before Rava ma'or ubsamim, the light, and they bring a candle, and they bring basamim. This is for Havdalah. So what does Rava do? Okay, he sees Brach Rava habsamim bereisha v'hada ama'or. He first does the bracha over the basamim, and only afterwards does do the bracha over the candle. Amale, so Rav Huna Bar Yehuda asks him very strangely. He says, "What exactly is going on?" V'ha bein Beit Shammai bein Beit Hillel ma'or bereisha v'hada basamim. I thought that even if you go by Shammai, Beit Shammai, or Beit Hillel, everyone agrees that you do the light first and then you do the basamim, you do the incense afterwards. So what's going on here? That's his question, right? Now the Gemara goes on to ask, what actually is this teaching of Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel that he's referring to? He goes, Mahi, what are you referring to? With the Tananim, we've learnt in the Mishnah, it says the following. It says, Beit Shammai omrim, ner umazon besamim v'havdalah. He says the candle first, then the mazon. Here they're referring to yayin, wine, as mazon, because it actually nurtures you like food. So they're referring to it as mazon. So yayin, ner, mazon, besamim, havdalah. That is Beit Shammai's way of looking at things. And Beit Hillel says, ner, ubsamim, mazon, havdalah. For the purposes of this discussion, what's interesting is that both of them have the ner before the besamim. And that's the important thing. The fact that they switch the wine and the basamim around, that's less of an issue. We're just discussing the case that the argument between Rav Huna Bar Yehuda and Rava, and that's what he's referring to. Why on earth would Rava, looking at these two opinions, still do the basamim before the ner? Okay, so Rava actually has an answer for him. Rava says, Ani Rava Bat Batre. He answers after him. But Amar, and he says, Zu divrei Rabbi Meir. What you just quoted, the argument between Hillel and Shammai, that's not everyone's opinion. That's Rabbi Meir's opinion. Okay, Rabbi Meir says that's the argument between Beit Hillel and Shammai, but there's a different opinion, right? But Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Rabbi Yehuda has a different opinion. Rabbi Yehuda says, Lo nechlaku Beit Shammai Beit Hillel al mazon shehu b'tchila v'al havdalah shi b'sof. Okay, they both agree that Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel both agree that the mazon is at the beginning and that the havdalah is at the end. That's not of issue. Aval, what do they argue about? Al ma nechlaku al ma'or v'al b'samim. They argue about the candle and the besamim, exactly what we're talking about. Beit Shammai omrim, just like you said, ma'or v'achar kach besamim. The candle comes before the besamim. You're right. That's what Beit Shammai says. Aval Beit Hillel omrim besamim v'achar kach ma'or. But the Beit Hillel say no. The besamim come before the candle, before the light. You say Berei b'nei besamim before you say Berei mirei ha'esh, which is a good thing to remember when someone's trying to turn off the lights during Havdalah, so they often turn them off early. You should always remember that the Besamim comes first, especially the person who's turning off the lights. Now, what's actually interesting is that Rabbi Yochanan clarifies, Rabbi Yochanan's Amorai in the first generation, and he clarifies at this point that what was the actual minhag that was done. What did people actually do? V'amar Rabbi Yochanan, nahagu ha'am kebeit Hillel aliba de Rabbi Yehuda. So we all do, like we do today, mazon b'samim ner havdalah. That's the standard havdalah. Every Shabbat, every Motzei Shabbos, that's the one that you should be doing. Okay, so moving on from there, okay, we now get onto another party. Now we're moving on from Havdalah completely. We're talking about, we'll actually come back to it at the end, but we're moving on to Havdalah for the moment. We're talking now about going back to the idea about drinking wine when you make the brachot for the wine and when you make brachot over the Birchat HaMazon. And the first story we have here is Rabbi Yaakov bar Abba ikla levei Rava. So Rabbi Yaakov bar Abba has also come to visit Rava a different time. Okay, and what does he see? He says, Chazei de barech berei pri hagafen, akasa kama, v'hada barech akasa b'divrchata v'ishti. So what he does is he makes berei pri hagafen over a cup of wine. He gets a cup of wine, makes berei pri hagafen, and then he gets another cup of wine and he benches over it, and only then does he drink. Right? So it's a strange way to behave, and he calls him out on it. He says, Amale lama lach kulehai. Why? What's the fuss about? Why are you doing all of this? Right? Notice that language. Lama lach kulehai is often what they say at these parties when they don't understand what's going on. Right? So he says, Lama lach kulehai. What on earth are you doing? Then he explains what he means. Haberechlan marcha dazimna. But surely you have already made the bracha once at the beginning of the meal. Why do you have to make the bracha again at the end of benching? Why do you have to make the bracha again at the end of benching if you already made the bracha at the beginning? You knew you were going to get some wine. Amalei, so Rabba says to him, Ki havinam bei Reish Galuta, hachi avdinan. When I was at Reish Galuta's house, that's exactly what they did. I went to the chief rabbi's house for dinner, and that's exactly what they did. They made the bracha again at the end. Amalei, he says, tinach bei Reish Galuta. The Hachi Avid. Of course you do that when you go to the chief rabbi's house. That's not a typical example. Why? The Safek Maitelan, Safek Le Maitelan. As you don't know whether they're going to bring you a second cup. So when you drink your first cup of wine, you're only thinking about your first cup of wine. So of course you're going to make a bracha specially for that cup and not for a cup later on. Hacha, in your own house, Hamanach Kasaka Mandatanilai. When you drink your first cup, you know there's going to be another cup coming up. So how can you possibly make two brachot? So the answer to this, Rava says, Ana avdei ketalmidei de Rav. I hold by the opinion of the Talmidim of Rav. Now, the Talmidim of Rav had a very important story, right? And this is the story which is about to come up. And we'll discuss this a little bit before we move on. So what is this thing about the story of the Talmidim of Rav? It's another story about people having a party. The Rav Beruna, the Rav Hananel. Rav Runa and Rav Hananel are the Talmidim of Rav, Heim Talmidei de Rav Havu, and they were having a party. Okay, and now we are They were Hayu Yatvei Basudata. They were sitting at a party. Now we're at the beginning of Kuf Gimel Amud Bet. And Kayalahu Rav Yeba Saba. Rav Yeba Saba was acting as their waiter at this party. Rav Yeba Saba was no slouch when it came to halacha himself, but he was in this case acting as their waiter. And they say to him, Havlan Nevarech, bring us wine so that we can do Birchat Hamazon. Waiter, bring us some wine for Birchat Hamazon. A bit like saying, bring us the bill, we're ready to finish. Okay? And of course, as these things go in a restaurant, you hang around after you've said you're going to go for a long time, and they decide to have a bit more to drink. So the Besaf Amru, and later on they said to him, Hav lanu v'nishte, bring us some more wine so we can drink. A bit of an awkward situation for a waiter who knows what he's doing, because he says to them, Amarle, Hachi Amar Rav, this is what Rav, your teacher, actually teaches, that I'm not really supposed to bring you wine now. Kevan da amritu havlan nevarech. Since you already said bring us some wine to bench, itzare lachula mishte. You're not allowed to drink anymore without making another bracha, right? What's the reason for that? My tama, because you've already taken your minds off drinking. So if you want to make another drink, you're going to have to make another bracha. So until you make another bracha, I'm not going to bring you more wine. An interesting little story there. I'm a bit of a cheeky waiter, but there we are. And that waiter, Rav Yehuda Saba, presents to us what is the position of the Talmidei the Rav. The Talmidei the Rav, the position of Talmidei the Rav was that if you get to benching, you have to make a bracha again, because you've basically taken your mind off the meal. The meal is finished once you get to the benching. There's another story which revolves around this, in which we have some Rabbanim who are eating together. And that's about three Rabbanim, Amema, Umar Zutra, Rav Ashi. These three Rabbanim, okay, are sitting eating together. Habu Yatve Basuda. They were all eating a meal together. V'kai Alaihu Rav Acha Barei Rava. And in this case, Rav Acha Barei Rava was acting as their waiter. Okay, I think it was quite a prestigious job to be the waiter of great Rabbanim. I don't think it's dumb that you have these great Rabbanim who are being waiters for other Rabbanim. I think there's a very, very clear underlying comment in this whole discussion where you see there's no shame in being a waiter. There's no shame in serving other people, which is, again, very relevant to the Seder night. All these things are introductions to what we do at Seder night, where we give each other wine and we act as servants for the other people. It's no shame to do that, because you can learn from other people by doing it that way. Anyway, what happens is Rav Acha Barei Rava is giving them wine, and they all have very different minhagim, and he's getting very confused, because what happens is Ameima birech al kol kasa v'kasa. He makes a bracha on every single cup of wine he gets. Gets a cup, Rei Brigafen drinks it. Gets a cup, Rei Brigafen drinks it. Every cup drinks it himself. Makes a bracha separately. Mar Zutra does differently. Mar Zutra barecha kasa kama v'kasa batra. He only makes a bracha over the first cup, and he makes a bracha over the last cup. The last cup, I assume, is the Birchat Hamazon cup. But those are the ones he does. And Rav Ashi, Barecha Kasakama, he makes a bracha over the first cup. The Tulo Barech, he doesn't make any bracha again after that. After the first cup, that's it. That's enough for Rav Ashi. So they're all doing totally different things. And this obviously is going to confuse our poor waiter here, Rav Acha Barei Rava, gets very confused. But on V'amaren, Anan Kaman Navid, what am I supposed to do? Which of you should I be following here? And Amema explains himself by saying, don't think of me like I'm making a bracha over each individual cup. Nimlachana, I'm a special case. I actually, every time I have a cup of wine, I think it's my last cup. He's one of those people that thinks he's only going to have the one cup. Oh, just give me one cup. And he makes a bracha over the one cup. He's convinced he's never going to have another cup. Sure enough, he has another cup. But he really wasn't thinking about it when he had the first cup. Therefore, he has to make another bracha for the second cup. And that's what Amema says when he says, Nimlach Ana. He's the guy that always thinks he's going to have one last cup of wine, and he doesn't realize he's going to have more afterwards. Mar Zutra says, Ana da'avdei Talmidei de Rav. Don't look at me. I'm doing exactly what the Talmidim of Rav do. I make a bracha for a wine, and then when it comes to Birchat Hamazon, I make a bracha for the Talmidei de Rav. That's exactly, there's no big surprises there. So Rav Ashi, what's he doing? Rav Ashi, leitil chatek Talmidei de Rav. You're right, you're doing according to Talmidim of Rav, but that's not how the halacha goes. The halacha isn't like the Talmidim of Rav. Okay, why not? Yom Tov shechal liyot achar Shabbat, because we've seen when Yom Tov falls after Shabbat, but Amar Rav yakneh. Rav says you do yayin, kiddush, ner, havdalah. So kiddush comes in between the yayin and the havdalah, and if kiddush isn't considered a break between yayin and havdalah, then how can you possibly, before you actually drink the wine, how can you possibly think that Birchat Hamazon is going to be a division between between the yayin and the drinking of the wine. In fact, that's not necessarily the case. Velohi, even though Rav Ashi was of that opinion, that is not the correct opinion. Hatam akadarte mishte. In the case where you don't make a bracha, that's because you have actually changed your mind and you decided to start benching. But in this case, in the case when you're actually doing the Havdalah and you say Kiddush and you say Havdalah, you're thinking about drinking all the way through. So in that case, it's a little bit different. So that's not exactly the same case. Okay, moving on. Okay, we get on to the next visit. Actually, the truth, this isn't the next visit. This is the same visit we were in before. Rav Yaakov bar Abba is still visiting Rava. He's still in the place of Rava. And what happens here, after he brought him the wine, it comes time for Havdalah. And what happens at time Havdalah? When it comes to time Havdalah, okay, Kam Shameh, his shamus gets up, his servant gets up, Va'adlik avuka mishaga, he lights a torch, a flaming torch. He lights a torch from the candle. So he asks the question, Yaakov bar Abba, again, Lama lach kulehai, what's all the fuss about here? You've got a candle, use the candle. Why are you lighting a massive great torch in order to make Havdalah? Okay? To which Rava says, Amarle, Shama midatele nafshekavid. The answer here is a bit of a cop-out. Rava says, actually, I'm not saying that you have to do this. It was the idea of the servant who did it. To which Yaakov bar isn't buying any of that. He goes, servant wouldn't have done that if he hadn't heard about it from you. A servant wouldn't be doing something like that without checking with you first. So what's really going on? But Amarle, typical Jew, he answers with a question. Don't you also think that avuka lahavdalah mitzvah min hamuvcha, that it would be nicer to make havdalah with a torch? Suggesting that you don't actually have to use a torch, you don't have to use a flaming torch, but it's nicer to use a flaming torch than to use just a simple candle. So he's saying you should do that. In fact, today we know that we have a minhag that we always, or the Ashkenazim at least, have a minhag always to use more than one candle, more than one wick to make it like a madura, because that's the mitzvah min hamuvcha. Moving on, what happens afterwards? Rava then starts to make Havdalah, and he says, Hamavdil ben kodesh lachol, ben or lachoshech, ben Yisrael amim, ben yom hashvi l'shesh jemei amase. Now notice, we're very familiar with this phrase, because that's how we say Havdalah every week. But it's a bit odd, because Hamavdil ben kodesh lachol should be enough. You know, that should be enough. What's all this other stuff about Yisrael v'amim and the 7 days of the week? What's going on there? Amarle, so he says to him, okay, Lamalach kulehai. Why are you saying all these things? This Yaakov bar Abba is again asking the question of Rava. Why are you saying all these things in Havdalah? V'hamar Rav Yehuda amar Rav. Rav Yehuda says in the name of Rav that Hamavdil ben kodesh lachol is enough. Zohi Havdalato shel Rav Yehuda Nasi. That was enough for Rav Yehuda Nasi. Why isn't it enough for you? To which he answers, and this is an introduction to what we're going to be dealing with tomorrow, he says, Ana kahasavir alei. I hold by the opinion that says, the Amar Rabbi Elazar, Amar Rabbi Yoshaya. Rabbi Elazar says, in the name of Rabbi Yoshaya, Hapochet lo yifchot mishalosh, v'hamosif lo yosif al sheva. The smallest number of things you mention in Havdalah is 3. And I mentioned 3. Hamavdil ben kodesh lachol, ben or lachoshech, ben Yisrael la'amim. That's the minimum. You can't do less than that. Right? And if you were to do more, you can't do more than 7. And tomorrow we will find out what those 7 are. And we shall continue with this then.